The jungle moon of Kiaras 4 was alive with sound. Chirps, screeches, and low thrums blended into an alien symphony as sunlight filtered through the dense canopy. Corporal Elias Varon trudged through the undergrowth, his medkit slung over one shoulder and a handheld scanner in his other hand. Sweat clung to his brow as he paused to check his map, its glowing holographic interface displaying his intended coordinates deep within the uncharted region of the moon. "I signed up to patch up soldiers, not play jungle explorer," Elias muttered under his breath. The communication unit on his wrist buzzed to life. "Corporal Varon, you're nearing the source of the distress beacon. Any sign of survivors?" Elias tapped the comm to respond. "Not yet, Captain Raln, but the signal's strong. I should be there soon." "Be cautious," the captain replied. "Kiaros 4 is home to apex predators, and you're in their territory." "Understood," Elias replied, suppressing a shiver. "Apex predators? Massive, six-limbed creatures known as Mazari. Their razor-sharp claws, armored scales, and cunning pack tactics made them the undisputed rulers of Kiaros 4. As he pushed forward, the scanner emitted a sharp ping. Elias froze, glancing down to see a life signature nearby. It was faint, but distinct. He quickened his pace, careful to step around thick roots and patches of bioluminescent moss. Finally, he broke into a small clearing and found the source of the signal. Lying amidst a cluster of broken branches and crushed plants was a small Mazari cub. Its scaled body was tangled in the remains of what looked like a hunting trap. The cub's deep green eyes fluttered open at his approach, filled with a mix of pain and fear. Elias sucked in a breath. He hadn't expected to find one of them. The cub was no larger than a medium-sized dog, but even as a juvenile, it had the sharp claws and powerful limbs of its species. Blood dripped from a deep wound on its flank, where the trap's jagged metal had pierced its scales. "Poor thing," Elias murmured, crouching down slowly. He reached for the med kit, keeping his movements deliberate. The cub hissed weakly, bearing a set of needle-like teeth. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice low and soothing. "I'm here to help." The cub's growl faded into a pained whimper as Elias approached. He carefully examined the trap, grimacing at the cruelty of the design. It was primitive yet brutal, clearly meant to immobilize rather than kill. Whoever had set it likely intended to capture the Mazari for profit, or worse. Elias pulled a pair of cutters from his kit and began to dismantle the trap. The cub flinched as the metal shifted, but it didn't attack. Instead, it watched him with a wary intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. "There we go," Elias said, as the last piece of the trap fell away. He reached for a hypo syringe, filled with a painkiller and anti-inflammatory. "This'll help with the pain, to keep us all together in the face of the promise of billions' lives at risk." As he pressed the syringe against the cub's scales, it let out a startled yelp, but didn't resist. Elias worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying a regenerative sealant to stop the bleeding. The cub's breathing slowed as the medication took effect, its body relaxing slightly. "Not so scary now, are you?" Elias said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the clearing. Elias froze, his hand halfway to his medkit. He turned slowly to see a massive Mazari standing at the edge of the clearing, its 6 limbs tensed and its amber eyes locked on him. The adult Mazari was easily 3 meters long, its scaled body gleaming in the dappled sunlight. This was the apex predator he'd been warned about. Elias's heart pounded as he raised his hand slowly. "I was just helping," he said, knowing full well the creature wouldn't understand. The adult Mazari sniffed the air, its gaze shifting between Elias and the cub. For a moment, The tension in the clearing was suffocating. Then, to Elias's astonishment, the massive predator stepped forward, nuzzling the cub gently. The cub let out a soft chirp, and the adult's body relaxed slightly. Elias took a cautious step back, his hand still raised. "All right, I'll just leave you two to it." Before he could retreat further, the cub scrambled to its feet and limped toward him. It let out a plaintive chirp, rubbing its scaled head against his leg. "Oh no!" Elias whispered, glancing at the adult Mazari. "You've got to stay with your... The adult Mazari's gaze softened, almost as if it were acknowledging Elias's role in saving its offspring. With a low rumble, it nudged the cub closer to him before stepping back into the jungle. Elias blinked in disbelief as the massive creature disappeared into the foliage, leaving him alone with the cub. "Well, I guess you're coming with me," Elias said, crouching to meet the cub's curious gaze. It chirped again, nipping playfully at his sleeve. He sighed. Captain Raun is going to love this. By the time Elias returned to the base camp, the cub had settled into his arms, its small body surprisingly warm against his chest. The other medics and soldiers stared as he approached, their expressions a mix of shock and amusement. "Varon," Captain Raun said, stepping forward. "What is that?" Elias set the cub down gently, holding up his hands. "I found it caught in a trap. It was injured. I couldn't just leave it." The captain's gaze shifted between Elias and the cub, her brow furrowed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That's a Mazari. If the parent comes looking—" "It already did," Elias interrupted. "And it let me go. It wanted me to take the cub." Raun blinked, clearly skeptical. "You're telling me an apex predator entrusted you with its offspring?" You blinked more than a few times, and you're definitely related to the thing we believe made the move? "Trust me, I'm just as confused as you are," Elias admitted. "But it didn't attack. It watched." The cub chirped, pawing at Elias's boot. A ripple of laughter spread through the gathered soldiers. "Well," Rollins said after a moment, pinching the bridge of her nose, "well, we can't exactly send it back into the jungle now. It's the base isn't equipped for this, but it's your responsibility. If it so much as looks at someone the wrong way, it's on you." Elias nodded, relief washing over him. Understood. As the days passed, the cub, whom Elias had nicknamed Sari, adapted quickly to life at the base. It followed Elias everywhere, chirping for attention and curling up by his cot at night. Though wary at first, the other soldiers grew fond of the cub, marveling at its playful antics. But the peace didn't last. One night, as the base settled into quiet, the alarms blared. Elias jolted awake, grabbing his medkit as soldiers scrambled to their stations. "What's happening?" he shouted to a nearby officer. "Raiders," the officer replied, panic in his voice. "They're targeting the outpost." Elias's stomach clenched. Mercenaries, and poachers who scoured the galaxy for valuable resources and exotic creatures. He had no doubt they were here for the Mazari. Before he could process further, Sari let out a sharp growl, its scales bristling. The cub darted toward the perimeter, moving faster than Elias thought possible. "Sorry, wait!" he shouted, grabbing his gear and running after it. As he reached the edge of the base, he froze. Sari stood between the raiders and the base, its small body poised to defend. From the jungle beyond came a deep, familiar growl. The adult Mazari stepped into the clearing, its eyes blazing with fury as it faced the intruders. Elias realized, with a surge of awe, that the apex predator hadn't abandoned its cub. It had been watching all along. The raiders froze as the massive Mazari emerged from the jungle, its amber eyes locked onto them. The sight of the towering predator, its scales glinting like living armor, made even the most battle-hardened mercenaries hesitate. One of them, braver or perhaps more reckless than the rest, raised a plasma rifle. Elias's heart leapt into his throat. "Don't shoot!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The raider ignored him, aiming squarely at the Mazari. Before he could fire, a deafening roar filled the air. The Mazari lunged, moving with a speed that defied its massive size. In an instant, the raider was thrown backward, his weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. The rest of the mercenaries scrambled to regroup, their formation breaking under the sheer ferocity of the attack. "Sorry," Elias called, searching for the cub. He spotted it darting between the legs of the adult Mazari, growling at the intruders with a defiance that was both endearing and alarming. Elias grabbed his comm unit. "Captain Ron, we need reinforcements at the south perimeter. Now." The captain's voice crackled in his ear. "Reinforcements are on the way. Hold the line." Hold the line? Against a group of armed raiders? Elias wasn't a soldier, he was a medic. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the front lines, yet here he was, crouched behind a cluster of rocks as the situation spiraled out of control. The adult Mazari continued to hold its ground, its movements a terrifying blend of precision and power. Every swipe of its claws sent the raiders scattering, their weapons ineffective against its armored scales. It wasn't fighting alone. Sari darted in and out of the fray, targeting the raiders' legs with surprising accuracy. The combination of brute strength and speed was overwhelming. Elias spotted one of the raiders trying to flank the Mazari, a compact grenade launcher in hand. His instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he grabbed a rock and hurled it with all his strength. The projectile hit its mark, striking the raider's hand and knocking the weapon loose. The raider turned toward him, anger flashing in his eyes. "You've got to be kidding me," Elias muttered as the mercenary charged. Before the raider could close the distance, a blur of scales shot past Elias. Sari tackled the raider, its sharp claws leaving a shallow but painful gash across his arm. The man yelped, stumbling backward before retreating into the jungle. "Good work, Sari," Elias said, his voice shaky. The cub chirped in response, its tail swishing as it returned to his side. The adult Mazari roared again, its voice echoing across the base. The remaining raiders, realizing they were outmatched, began a hasty retreat. "Base perimeter secure," Captain Rowland's voice crackled over the comms. "What's the situation?" Elias exhaled a shaky breath, rising to his feet. "The raiders are retreating, thanks to our, unexpected allies." The captain arrived moments later, leading a squad of soldiers. She stopped short when she saw the adult Mazari standing protectively over its cub and Elias. For a long moment, no one spoke. The soldiers kept their weapons trained on the predator, though none dared to fire. "What in the stars happened here?" Ron finally asked. Elias stepped forward, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. The Mazari defended the base. It wasn't just protecting Sari, it was protecting all of us. Ralnu's eyes narrowed. "Just saying an apex predator just decided to help us out of the goodness of its heart?" "No," Elias admitted. "It helped because I saved its cub. This is its way of returning the favor." Raul glanced at the Mazari, then back at Elias. "And how long do you think that favor will last?" Elias looked at the massive predator, its gaze meeting his with a strange mix of intelligence and understanding. "As long as it takes." The attack changed everything. Word spread quickly through the base about the Mazari that had saved them. While some soldiers remained uneasy, others were in awe. They began to treat Sari not as a threat but as a mascot, often sneaking scraps of food to the playful cub when Elias wasn't looking. The adult Mazari, whom Elias began to call Kale, didn't leave. It lingered near the edge of the base, watching over the camp like a silent guardian. It never approached too closely, but its presence was a constant reminder of the fragile bond they had formed. Elias spent his days tending to his usual duties as a medic, though Sari's antics often disrupted his work. The cub had a knack for sneaking into the infirmary, where it would curl up under the examination table or bat at medical tools with its claws. Elias couldn't bring himself to scold it. "You're going to get me in trouble," he said one evening as he gently pushed Sari off a pile of bandages. The cub chirped innocently, its tail flicking. Despite the cub's mischief, Elias couldn't deny that Sari had become a part of his life. The bond they shared was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Sari trusted him completely, and in return, Elias felt a fierce protectiveness for the little predator. But the peace didn't last. Days after the raid, a distress call came from a nearby settlement. The message was garbled, but the urgency was clear. Raiders had returned, this time targeting civilians. Captain Rain called an emergency meeting, her expression grim. "We can't ignore this," she said, addressing the assembled soldiers. "The settlement is vulnerable, and we're the closest force that can respond." Elias stepped forward. "What's the plan?" Roland hesitated. "We'll mobilize a strike team, but the odds aren't in our favor. The raiders outnumber us and their tech is better than ours." A low growl echoed through the room. Everyone turned to see Kale standing in the doorway, its amber eyes burning with intensity. Sari sat beside it, chirping softly. Elias smiled faintly. "We're not outnumbered. We've got them." Ran looked at the Mazari, her skepticism fading into resolve. "All right, Varon. Let's see if your guardian angels can tip the scales." The settlement was a patchwork of prefabricated buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by jagged cliffs. Smoke rose in thin columns from several structures, evidence of the raiders' destructive path. As the transport neared the edge of the valley, Elias could see frightened civilians huddled in the center of the settlement, their faces pale with fear. Sari paced restlessly in the transport's cargo hold, its claws clicking against the floor. Ko crouched beside it, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The adult Mazari's presence had an electrifying effect on the soldiers. Many were tense, casting wary glances at the apex predator, while others radiated cautious hope. Elias knelt beside Sari, running a hand over the cub's scaled head. "You've got to stick close to Kale, all right? This is going to get messy." Sari chirped in response, its tail flicking with impatience. Kale's gaze shifted to Elias, its eyes steady and deliberate. It was as if the predator understood the stakes. Captain Rollins' voice came over the comms. "Touchdown in 2 minutes. Teams Alpha and Beta will engage the raiders directly. Corporal Varon, your companions are tasked with clearing the settlement perimeter. Keep those civilians safe." Elias nodded, though his nerves were frayed. He had no experience leading a mission, much less coordinating with 2 Mazari. But as the transport doors opened, revealing the chaos below, there was no time to hesitate. "Go!" Ron shouted, and the soldiers spilled out of the transport, weapons ready. Kale leapt forward, its massive form landing with a thunderous impact that shook the ground. Sari followed, darting between its legs as they charged toward the settlement. Elias ran after them, his medkit bouncing against his side. The raiders had fortified their positions around the perimeter, using stolen equipment to establish makeshift barricades. Kale tore through their defenses like they were paper. With a single swipe of its claws, it toppled a barricade, scattering the raiders behind it. The predator's roar reverberated through the valley, a primal sound that sent several mercenaries fleeing. Sari wasn't far behind. The cub darted into the fray, its speed and agility making it nearly impossible to target. It weaved between raiders, slashing at their legs and disabling their weapons with precision strikes. Though smaller and less powerful than Kale, Sari was just as effective, using its size and cunning to outmaneuver the enemy. Elias focused on the civilians, guiding them away from the fighting and toward a safer position behind one of the intact buildings. "Stay low and stay quiet," he told them. "We'll get you out of here." One of the settlers, an older man clutching a crude plasma pistol, looked at Elias with wide eyes. "That thing? It's protecting us?" Elias glanced back at Kale, who had just dispatched another raider with a bone-shaking swipe of its tail. "Yeah," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's on our side." The tide of the battle began to turn. The raiders, disorganized and overwhelmed by the Mazari's assault, started retreating toward the cliffs. Captain Raum's voice crackled over the comms. "Push them back. Don't let them regroup." Elias spotted a group of raiders attempting to flank the soldiers from the north. He shouted a warning, but they were already moving too quickly. Before he could react, Kale pivoted, its massive body blocking the raiders' path. The predator roared, its teeth bared in a display of raw power. The raiders skidded to a halt, their weapons shaking in their hands. "Stand down!" one of them shouted, panic seeping into his voice. "We can't take that thing." Kale didn't give them the chance to retreat. It lunged, scattering the group with terrifying efficiency. Elias turned his attention back to Sari, who had cornered a particularly stubborn raider near the settlement's supply depot. The man raised his weapon, aiming at the cub. "Sari!" Elias shouted, sprinting toward them. The raider fired just as Elias reached Sari. He threw himself between the cub and the blast, bracing for the impact. But Kale appeared out of nowhere, shielding them both. The plasma bolt struck the Mazari's armored flank and dissipated harmlessly. The raider froze, his face pale, as Kale loomed over him. With a guttural growl, the predator swatted the man's weapon away and pinned him to the ground. Sari chirped triumphantly, nipping at the raider's boot. Elias exhaled shakily, resting a hand on Kale's side. Good timing. Kale rumbled in response, its gaze briefly meeting his before returning to the battlefield. Together, the three of them moved to secure the rest of the settlement. By the time the battle ended, the raiders had been driven out of the valley. The soldiers began sweeping the area for survivors and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. And the settlers emerged cautiously, their relief palpable as they saw the raiders retreating into the distance. Captain Relna approached Elias, her expression a mix of exhaustion and admiration. "You and your team did good work, Varon. Those settlers wouldn't have stood a chance without you." Elias glanced at Kale and Sari, who were resting near the edge of the settlement. Kale was licking a shallow wound on its forelimb, while Sari chirped excitedly, clearly pleased with itself. "They did most of the work," Elias said, a small smile on his face. "I just kept up." Rowland shook her head. You're too modest. That bond you've got with them, it's not something you see every day. They trust you, and that's what made this mission possible." Elias nodded, his gaze softening as he watched the two Mazari. "They're more than just allies. They're family." As the settlement began to rebuild, Kale and Sari stayed close to Elias. The settlers, initially wary of the predators, gradually warmed to them, especially Sari. The cub had a way of charming even the most skeptical with its playful antics and boundless energy. Kale, meanwhile, became a silent guardian, patrolling the outskirts of the settlement and ensuring the raiders didn't return. Its presence alone was enough to deter any potential threats. Elias found himself wondering what the future held. Kale and Sari had become an inseparable part of his life, but he knew the jungle moon of Kiaros IV wasn't a permanent home. Sooner or later he would have to leave, and when that time came, he wasn't sure if the Mazari would come with him. For now, though, he focused on the present. Together, they had survived the impossible, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and the settlement transformed from a cluster of scorched buildings to a thriving outpost. The settlers worked tirelessly to rebuild, their efforts bolstered by the soldiers stationed nearby. KL continued its patrols along the perimeter, a silent but ever-present guardian, while Sari became a constant companion to Elias. The cub's boundless energy and curiosity brought life to even the most mundane tasks, its playful antics lifting the spirits of everyone at the outpost. Elias had fallen into a routine, splitting his time between treating the settlers and soldiers, assisting with reconstruction, and keeping up with Sari. Kale, ever watchful, would occasionally join them, a massive shadow that moved with surprising grace. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and while Elias knew better than to claim he fully understood the Mazari, he felt a profound sense of trust and connection. One quiet afternoon, Elias was restocking the medical supplies in the infirmary when Captain Reln appeared at the door. Her expression was serious, her arms crossed over her uniform. "We need to talk, Varon," she said. Elias set down a vial of antiseptic and straightened. "What's going on?" Reln stepped inside, her tone measured. "Our scouts picked up chatter from the raiders. They're regrouping, and this time they're coming back with reinforcements. If they hit the settlement again, it'll be a full-scale assault." Elias's stomach dropped. "How much time do we have?" 2 days, maybe less, Roland replied. "We've sent for reinforcements, but there's no guarantee they'll arrive in time." Elias nodded, his mind already racing. "What's the plan?" Relna hesitated. "I've been thinking about your arrangement with the Mazari. Kale and Sari have been instrumental in keeping this place safe. If we're going to stand a chance, we'll need their help again." Elias frowned. "Kale's been patrolling the perimeter on its own. It'll fight to protect Sari and the settlement, but I can't promise it'll follow orders." "I'm not asking you to turn it into a soldier," Ern said, "but if there's anyone who can guide it, it's you." Elias took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the window. Outside, he could see Kale resting beneath a tree, its massive form blending seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. Sari was bounding in circles nearby, chasing an unlucky insect. "I'll talk to them," Elias said at last. "We'll do what we can." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias approached Kale's resting spot. The adult Mazari lifted its head at his approach, its amber eyes gleaming in the fading light. Sari chirped in greeting, bounding over to nuzzle his leg. Elias crouched beside Kale, meeting its gaze. "We've got trouble," he said quietly. "The raiders are coming back, and this time it's going to be worse. I don't know if we can hold them off on our own." Kale rumbled softly, a sound that resonated deep in Elias's chest. It wasn't a growl or a warning. It was acknowledgement, understanding. "I don't want to put you in danger," Elias continued, "but if you and Sari are with us, we might have a chance." The Mazari tilted its head slightly, its expression inscrutable. After a long moment, it rose to its feet, towering over Elias. Sari followed suit, chirping with excitement. Elias smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a yes." The next day was a flurry of preparation. The soldiers fortified the settlement with makeshift barricades and defensive turrets, while the settlers armed themselves with whatever they could find. Kale and Sari roamed the perimeter, their presence a comforting sight amid the rising tension. By nightfall, the raiders arrived. Their ships descended like dark shadows, disgorging scores of heavily armed mercenaries. Floodlights illuminated the valley, casting stark shadows over the settlement. The raiders wasted no time opening fire on the outer defenses. Elias stood near the center of the settlement, his medkit at the ready. Kale and Sari flanked him, their bodies tense with anticipation. The soldiers had taken their positions along the barricades, weapons trained on the advancing raiders. The first wave hit hard, but the defenders held their ground. Kale charged into the fray with a deafening roar, scattering the raiders with its sheer force. It moved like a force of nature, tearing through their ranks with precision and ferocity. Sari darted alongside it, targeting weak points and disarming mercenaries with surprising efficiency. Elias worked tirelessly, moving between the injured and administering aid. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air, but he focused on his task, trusting Kale and Sari to keep him safe. As the battle raged on, the raiders deployed heavy artillery. A massive plasma cannon fired a blast that struck one of the barricades, reducing it to rubble. The defenders scrambled to regroup, but the raiders pressed their advantage. Kale roared, charging toward the cannon with unrelenting determination. Plasma bolts ricocheted off its armored scales as it closed the distance. With a powerful leap, it landed on the cannon, crushing it beneath its weight. The resulting explosion lit up the night, forcing both sides to momentarily shield their eyes. When the smoke cleared, Kale stood unharmed, its silhouette framed by the burning wreckage. A collective cheer rose from the defenders, their morale surging. The raiders, now disorganized and demoralized, began to retreat. Sari chased after them, nipping at their heels before returning to Elias's side. Kale let out a final roar, a sound that echoed through the valley and left no doubt as to who held dominion. By dawn, the settlement was quiet. The raiders were gone, their forces scattered. The defenders, though battered and exhausted, had emerged victorious. Elias sat on the steps of the infirmary, his head resting in his hands. Sari curled up beside him, its breathing slow and steady. Kale stood nearby, its gaze fixed on the horizon. Captain Rallin approached, a faint smile on her face. "We owe you one, Varon. You and your team." Elias chuckled weakly. "Just doing my job." Round glanced at Kale, her expression thoughtful. That Mazari could have left at any time. It didn't have to stay and fight, but it did. Because of you. Elias looked up at the towering predator, a mix of gratitude and awe in his eyes. "I think it knows what we're fighting for. It's not just about survival. It's about protecting what matters." Kale turned to him, its gaze steady and unwavering. In that moment, Elias understood that their bond went beyond words or logic. It was something deeper, something unshakable. As the sun rose over the valley, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Kale and Sari by his side, he knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they were more than a team. They were a family.